In my video on the way self-help books can be useful, I talked about this book, and I talked about one of my two big takeaways was the value of modularity, of breaking down projects as small as you can, or for my purposes, as small as you need to one-shot them, which is sort of how my strategy has been to do things. But I also said this idea of modularity is something I see a lot, and it is really interesting, really important, and I don't think it gets discussed enough. So I want to talk about that in 3 books where I have seen it come up that are sort of relevant to this. So the first one is this book, The Wizard and the Prophet by Charles Mann, who is best known for his books 1491 and 1493, and he actually comes from Amherst, which is where I went to middle school, high school, and college. Not Amherst College, Hampshire College. Never got to meet him, but it's sort of interesting that he's from where I'm from. But anyways, so this book was sort of addressing something that I had started grasping at the time. It was centered around the issue of nuclear power, because something you'll realize is anyone who knows about environmental policy, like in research academia, will be like, nuclear power is the best, like the greenest option. It has the best overall ecological footprint. The risks are dramatically overstated, and the costs are because of combination of basically just because of regulation plus non-standardization, because we haven't done it in a while. And so it was perplexing to me how many people who claim to be hardcore environmentalists were against nuclear power. And then I realized I was seeing patterns of like a lot of them just didn't like how big nuclear power plants are. Like they like rooftop solar, especially because it is one person can have it and you need a system to maintain it, but it's a lot more resilient on those smaller nodes. So this book is basically comparing 2 environmental approaches, the wizard approach of Norman Borlaug, who, if you don't know, saved hundreds of millions of people, I think it is, through the Green Revolution, improving staple crops, versus the prophet, who is, I think it's Paul Ehrlich, maybe I'm misremembering, but it's one of these green, like Malthusian doomsayer people. And he's starting with these principles and saying, okay, the wizard sort of tries to engineer your way out of things. The prophet, a big part of it is it's organic and modular, which fits in with the Nassim Nicholas Taleb book, Anti-Fragile, which one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. And so I was like, oh, this is interesting that there is this modularity is more resilient. Organic is more resilient as well, not in terms of like organic food, but in terms of like organic organisms, as Taleb talks about in Anti-Fragile. And so when I read this book, then I was like, oh yeah, I recognize it from this book, right? I recognize this idea of the importance of modularity from this book. So then 2 other books. I'm going to start with Dunbar, although I read it later. And you may have heard of Dunbar because of Dunbar's number, which is basically the fundamental group size for humans is about 150 people, roughly. And the exact numbers, I actually have a post on this on my Substack that I will link to, because he might be a little bit off on the exact numbers. But the point in this book is that it scales. So we have basically triads of relationships of this is my relation to this person and to someone else, and this is how we feel about them. And the 2 most stable are either we all like each other, or 2 of us like each other and we hate the third person. And our relationships with people are built up from those. So you have Dunbar circles starting at the circle of 1.5, because men generally either have a best friend, or a drinking buddy, or a partner, and then women generally have either 2 BFFs or a bestie and a partner. And then it scales from there at approximately 3, a little above 3 maybe, until you get up to 150, which is sort of the fundamental human sort of community level. But the key thing is that this modularity building of these relationships. And there's also limits on the size. There's a lot of interesting things in this book, but I wanted to mention it this time just for the modularity aspect of that in terms of how relationships are constructed. And then there is this book, which I have talked about multiple times, Ghost in the Machine by Arthur Koestler. It is with Taleb's Anti-Fragile, which I also mentioned but didn't show, one of my 2 all-time favorite, maybe not all, it's the two nonfiction books that have most influenced my current worldview understanding of emergent order. And so this book, he introduces the idea of holons, which are things that are complete in themselves but part of a larger whole, and I talked about this a little bit as well in my agency and communion video. But the other interesting thing about this book, so he has the parable of Bios and Mekos, who are 2 watchmakers. And so they're both good watchmakers, but then they start getting more orders. And Mekos, the more orders he gets, the fewer watches he makes. Bios, though, he scales. And why is this? Well, Mekos, he has watches that require all the parts to be put together at once. And so he gets a call, hey, I want to watch. He puts it down, it all falls apart, he has to start over. And eventually he gets so many calls that he can't assemble any watches. BIOS makes a few parts that stick together, that he sticks together with other parts that, same thing, and assembles these sub-assemblies into larger sub-assemblies until he has a whole watch. And so that scales. And that is consistent with this book on project management that I talked about, sort of breaking things down modularly. It's also consistent with Dunbar's account of how human relationships, human groups are built. And it is also consistent with Charles Mann's account of the profit side of this environmental debate. So I think this is interesting, and this is basically the reason I've suddenly been a lot more productive on my blog and on this channel is because I have started being more modular. I was basically trying to make whole video essays on this channel, starting with smaller ones, but like carefully edit them. And same thing with the blog. I was trying to have like everything sort of explained. Now I'm like, I'm just gonna, one interesting thing, move on. I don't have to get all of it because I can come back to it if it catches on. If it doesn't catch on and I want to come back to it, I still can. But trying to get everything, account for everything now is not only impossible, but it stops me from doing anything. And so doing that, you'll notice my blog. If you look at my blog, you'll see I suddenly started posting 2 posts a day, which I'm probably not keeping up, but still 1 a day, which is way better than I was doing. And this channel, I'm suddenly posting a video a day, which may end up getting to 2 a day. And it's because of sort of this process, keeping this idea of modularity in mind. And there's other things there too, but that is a big part of it. So I wanted to talk about this. Anyways, I'm Magpie. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.